Hi, welcome to the Frontline Club. Before I pass over to Mary Harper, who's going to be chairing tonight's event, can I please ask you all to switch your phones to silent, and if we can just wait for the mic for questions at the end. Over to you, Mary.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming and for not going on strike like so many other people have today. Tonight we're talking about a giant of Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where in some places votes are being counted from the election that was held on Monday, but in other places people are still waiting for their election materials to come. Because the country is so massive and logistically so complicated that people are still waiting to vote in this election. So we're going to have to wait quite a while to see who wins, who out of the 11 presidential candidates is going to win. We'll probably find that out next week. And who out of the more than 18,000 candidates for 500 parliamentary seats, we're going to have to wait until January, until we know the results of that. So even though we're in this kind of impasse situation, what we're going to discuss today is the challenges that whoever wins these elections, what challenges they're going to face. And if you think that Congo this year came bottom of the United Nations list of countries of human development indicators, it has a very complex conflict going on in the east of the country. And in fact, that part of Congo is known as the rape capital of the world because rape is used so systematically as an instrument of war. And despite all of this, Congo has got the most huge natural resources. So we're going to be asking questions like why, with a country that is so rich in so many ways, is often labelled as a failed state, and a country that is located right at the very heart of Africa, which could really be the powerhouse of the continent, in fact is just seen as a basket case by many people. Is that the right image of Congo? And luckily we have some very impressive people here who can help explore some of these questions, and I'll let them introduce themselves. So if we could start here and go along.
Natsumet Tesfaye. I work for a strategic advisory called Extortion Analysis. We work with entities who have operations across Africa, and we help them basically do business better by highlighting the risks and opportunities in each of these areas. Our primary focus is forecasting, so we tell them what we think is going to be the situation going forward. I'll share some of those views tonight about Congo, and I'll pass on to Jean. Am I right?
Councillor Jean-Roger Kaseki, the first councillor of Congolese origin elected in the United Kingdom, Islington Council. I'm very pleased to be here today and to discuss Congo with you. This is amazing to me, and I'm very grateful.
My name is Fiona Lloyd-Davis. I'm a journalist and filmmaker. I first went to Congo in 2001, and I've made a number of films and words and picture stories for BBC, Channel 4 and Al Jazeera, as well as print publications. And I was most recently there in Eastern Congo in September.
My name's Mike Davis. I work with a London-based NGO called Global Witness. We work on issues concerning the relationship between natural resource exploitation and trade, and corruption and conflict. And I work with a team which specialises in issues relating to armed conflict. We cover a range of countries, of which Congo is one, and we look particularly at the issue of conflict minerals in the east of the country.
Thank you very much. I think maybe, Jean, if we could start with you. Congo was the first place I ever went to as a journalist in the early 1990s, under the days of the dictator, President Mobutu.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking then, as a rather naive journalist, is there any point having anything other than a dictator for Congo? Because it's so huge, maybe the best way of holding it together is to have somebody like Mobutu. So I want to ask you, is there any point having these elections? Is it maybe not a better solution just to have someone like him? At least he held it together.
I don't think Congo needed someone like Mobutu because of dictatorship, because of brutality, corruption, and mismanagement. He destroyed completely the country. I think Congo is a country that has been through quite a lot since King Leopold went to Congo. And this is a country that has never functioned like a proper state since King Leopold. So the challenge for Congo is about building institutions, because there is a vacuum, political, military, on every aspect of life. So how do we help Congo rebuild? Through democracy. This is why we supported, we campaigned here, Congolese human rights campaigners in this country to convince the last government, last Labour government, to get involved with Congo. And the government has helped to organize the first democratic election in 2006, because the British government is the largest bilateral donor to Congo because of our effort. And democracy is the only way we could help Congo to rebuild institutions. This is what I can say, and for this election as well, which I think the positive is the elections happen, democracy is in Congo developing. This is the positive side of these elections. But the negative side is the government, the current government, should not cling on to power. This government should rebuild Congo's institutions. If the government doesn't do that, if the government cling on to power, Congo will slide back to what it was before. So all our effort here, all our monies, the British taxpayers' money spent since 2006 to help stabilize Congo will be wasted. So there is the positive side of these elections, which is welcoming. There has never been democracy in Congo. Democracy is taking root there, which is welcoming. But on the negative side, the current government should play by the democratic rules and help to rebuild institutions. If they don't do that, Congo will go back to what it was. And war will be there, civil war, and chaos, and human rights violation, massive human rights violation. So we have to help this government to abide by democratic rules. This is what I can answer for now. Yeah.
Thank you. And Natsna, would you work in the business of forecasting in terms of thinking about Congo's future after these elections? What is your analysis? What is your forecast?
It's very much dependent on the results of the elections. I would have to say that, firstly, if the incumbent, Joseph Kabila, were to win the presidency, and his party, the PPRD, were to win majorities in the respective legislative elections, then we're likely to see, as Jean has said, increasing control being consolidated within that party. And I think regardless of the outcome of the elections, what we've seen we've already seen seeds of unrest in pockets in areas of where there's discontent, and those seeds of unrest are likely to grow. I would highlight Bakongo in Katanga, where we've seen secessionist elements re-emerging, and I would highlight also the East, where most people will have assumed a number of these peacekeeping and peacemaking efforts have restored stability to the region, but it's more the quiet before the storm. And rather, the legislative elections themselves have revived ethnic rivalries in these regions, which raise the risk that recently disarmed or demobilized rebel groups will go back to the bush and continue, shifting alliances, changing the environment, so it would be very different from what we'd seen before. In terms of regional relations, I would just highlight that each neighbor has a different interest in the outcome of the elections. You have Congo Brazzaville and Angola who are not so keen on Kabila. They wouldn't go so as far as to intervene on his behalf. In our view, others disagree. But that is definitely something to watch as the election results come in, to see how closely it will be called. I think the reported irregularities by election observers, both from the NGO community but also from the AU themselves admitting it, is something to watch. And it gives the opposition fuel to stoke unrest based on allegations of electoral fraud. And considering the attacks you've seen in polling stations, the delays, the reports of ballot stuffing or pre-checked ballots, this all serves to undermine the results that are likely to come. And so it's key to look at where the neighbors are falling, what side they're falling on. And as I said, Congo Brazzaville and Angola are very much on the line, though I think they're more likely to favor anyone outside of Kabila. I think Uganda is very much on the fence, whereas Rwanda and Burundi by default are very much pro-Kabila because they very much understand the negative externalities of what were to happen if Kabila were to be removed in the eastern provinces. Going forward, I think that this election is a second democratic election that you've seen in Congo. So it is key in the democratization process that the Congolese public does feel as if they are choosing their leader in terms of fostering a sense of national cohesion going forward. Because as you've already highlighted, previously it's always been ruled by self-appointed leaders who have almost recently stepped down within the past decade.
And Fiona, you recently have been in Eastern Congo, which some people almost see that as a separate problem, almost a separate state with its fighting its own mini wars. How disjointed did you find Eastern Congo from the rest, and what would you say are the main challenges there?
I think that the main challenges in Eastern Congo are impunity, that there are still many groups, militia groups who are armed, and those that have been absorbed into the army as well have been rewarded largely by the government for human rights abuses, to the extent that Sheka, the Mai Mai militia leader from Walikale, who was involved in the mass rapes last August, where between 300 and 500 women and some men were raped. He was standing for election, and we'll find out next week whether he was elected or not. The UN and Global Witness today have issued a statement, which obviously Mike can talk more about, issuing sanctions against Sheka. But he's a very good example of the way that the impunity, not just impunity, but being rewarded for committing these crimes is being continued in Eastern Congo. Another good example is Bosco Ntaganda, who is supported by Kabila and Rwanda, and he's now the de facto most powerful commander in Eastern Congo, with 50,000 troops under his command, and he is an indicted war criminal by the International Criminal Court. There's an arrest warrant out for his arrest, and he lives openly, he goes to work, and he goes to eat in the best restaurants and play tennis. He is continued to be supported by Kabila. So until really there is an end to impunity, and there is an example set that when these commanders, when these Mai Mai militia leaders commit crimes, rape large numbers of women, they are being rewarded at the moment. Until that stops, I think that's the greatest challenge really to Eastern Congo.
And there have been these mobile courts set up to try to deal with the problem of rape. Were you able to find out whether they were effective at all?
Well, most recent times that I've been working, certainly this year, I've been working in Goma, in North Kivu and South Kivu, and I haven't been as far down as Fizi Baraka, where there was a fantastic development that a mobile court tried the colonel, I think he was, who committed some rapes in January or New Year's Day of this year. And it's a huge step forward, and obviously does start to send a signal out that senior members of the military, like a colonel, can be brought to account. And there was a very quick trial, and it did send the signal out. But unfortunately, when you have such senior leaders like Bosco Ntaganda, who's a general, who's the number 2, his boss is receiving healthcare in India, and so he's now the de facto head of forces in Eastern Congo. Until that ends, the mobile courts are a great start, but I think they're incredibly limited. And I think for local people on the ground as well, Fizi Baraka is a long way from Goma or Minova or from the Haut Plateau area where rapes are still happening all the time. The woman whose centre I was filming was receiving maybe between 30 and 40 raped women almost every month. So the idea that this is stopping is just not true. Unfortunately, it's continuing. So the mobile courts are a great start, and it's fantastic they're happening, but it needs to be much wider spread, and it needs to come down from the government. You can't have generals and senior military people being rewarded by the government for committing human rights abuses and committing crimes. They have to be brought to account.
And Mike, another problem in Eastern Congo, apart from the rape, is this problem of minerals being exploited by foreign forces, by rebels, by government soldiers, and them lining their pockets with the proceeds. You've been campaigning at Global Witness for a long time for something to be done about this. Have you made any progress? Can you give us a picture of what the situation is now?
Yeah, I can try. There's a lot to say. I'll attempt to be brief. It is, as is often the case, I think, with issues in Congo, it is a mixed picture. In some respects, things have not, at a basic level, changed very much at all. You've got many of, perhaps most of, the major mining areas in Eastern Congo are still under the control of one type of group of armed men or another. Now, the configurations and patterns of control do change. They've actually changed quite a lot in the past 3 years. But the basic problem of those key parts of the minerals trade being militarized, if you will, remains. And when you look at the headline grabbers amongst the most violent and notorious armed groups now, they all have, in terms of their operations and power, a pretty tight connection with the minerals trade. You've got Bosco Ntaganda, who, since his defection to the government army, has become hugely more influential in the minerals sector than he ever was before. And you're talking about a guy who, according to data that we've been gathering on trips to the Kivus in recent months, has been almost personally supervising major smuggling operations literally through his back door into Rwanda. He's got a property very conveniently situated on the border. The group which he heads, the CNDP, has gone from being a powerful insurgency, but one which had quite a limited geographical scope, to one which has been effectively awarded control of some of the most mineral-rich areas of the Kivus as a reward for joining the government forces. And then you've got others like the FDLR, who of course remain heavily dependent on the mineral sector, increasingly gold, because they've been displaced from other areas by the CNDP forces under Bosco, and then others still like the group which Fiona just mentioned, the Mai Mai Cheka, whose leader was placed on the UN sanctions list 2 days ago. And Cheka is a particularly interesting and appalling case, because this is a man who actually has no military experience at all. His background is in the minerals trade, who set up an armed group which was substantially geared towards seizing control of parts of the mineral sector and gouging money out of it, who was advised, according to very well-placed sources, by some of his sponsors in the army, if you want to make a name for yourself, if you want to get more power and attention, what you want to do is not commit a massacre, but you need to commit some gross act of mass sexual violence, because that's the issue which will get the attention of international policymakers. And that was the backdrop to the rapes which Fiona talked about last year. So on that level, things are pretty dismal, it has to be said. There are some positives. Some of those, well, quite a lot of those are more at the level of policy and rhetoric than actual change on the ground. But that doesn't mean that they're not significant. the Congolese government has gone from a situation in which it's been in complete denial about this problem for a number of years to admitting in a surprisingly public way the depth of the issue that it has to confront. You've got a president who's actually gone on record saying, we have mafia groups in our army. This is quite unusual. More unusual still is the fact that the Congolese government has acquiesced to the UN Security Council passing successive sanctions resolutions which are aimed at part at its own armed forces. That's actually pretty extraordinary in UN terms, where sovereignty is a byword and an excuse for inaction at almost every turn. So that's a shift, and you do have some things which have been worked through at a more technical level through the Ministry of Mines and other agencies to introduce better controls on the ground, traceability schemes for minerals, checks of mining areas, and reports involving Congolese civil society to ascertain the level of military interference. And most recently, the Congolese government has passed a directive which actually puts into law some international so-called due diligence standards for companies in the mineral sector, which have been developed under the auspices of the OECD. It doesn't mean that the law is immediately going to be enforced, but it does provide a bit more leverage over companies operating in the Kivus and closes a little bit the space in which they can do what they want. And that takes us on to the international level, where there's been a lot of movement in the past 3 years. I mentioned the UN Security Council already. They did change the dynamic in terms of the way that companies looked at this quite substantially 3 years ago, when they made it possible for the first time to list companies trading conflict minerals on the sanctions list. And that means having your assets frozen and a ban on you traveling. And since then, we've had a few things which are in some ways disparate, but do have a common thread in terms of laying down in international fora, in international rules, standards for companies that want to use minerals coming out of Kivus. And those have taken the form, if you like, in sort of more soft law terms of the UN and the OECD issuing standards of due diligence for companies using these materials, the checks that they need to do and show that they've done. And then at the legislative level, you've got this piece of legislation called the Dodd-Frank Act in the US, which has been passed but not completed, which calls on companies which file in the US, report to the regulator there, to carry out due diligence on their supply chains and show that they've done it. And this law is controversial. It's also not complete. So we have this rather strange debate where people are talking about the law means this, the law means that, but the regulations which actually flesh it out and give it full form have not actually been announced, let alone has anyone actually started implementing it. So in summary, in many ways, the picture on the ground doesn't look that much better, but some of the things that you would inevitably need to happen to start moving progress forward in terms of people being more honest about the problem and the regulatory basis being put in place to change things, there has been progress in that regard. So it's a glass half full, glass half empty scenario.
Basically, the picture that we're getting from Congo, there's a few glimmers of hope, but it is pretty bleak. But at the same time, it's a place that's so rich in resources, and even though the state has, as many people say, has failed or is failing, there are positive things happening there. People are incredibly resourceful. And Jean, I wonder if you could talk about some of the opportunities that are available in Congo, talk about some of the more positive things that are happening or that at least could happen.
Right. I think Congo, as you mentioned, is a very rich country with mineral resources. I think there could be plenty of opportunities if those resources are used properly, and then if we manage to stop the illegal exploitation of those minerals.
Do you see any of the presidential candidates as offering genuine hope if they were to win?
Right. Reading through their manifesto, they are promising, because first of all, you need security, because security is a huge problem, huge issue there. You need, I've mentioned about vacuum, military vacuum. You need to build a national army, because law and order are key issue there. You need a police force to protect the people. And then, because you've got guns everywhere. You've got militias with guns everywhere. So how do we work toward prosperity, for instance? How do we work toward creating an environment where there will be plenty of opportunities for investment, for British companies to go there to invest? So this is a key issue there in the DRC. And then another issue is about disarmament. So we need a proper and workable strategy about disarming the militias. You've got militias everywhere, guns everywhere. This is chaos, complete chaos. So where do we start? So on security issues, I think the international community should now focus on how to disarm those militias in Congo. And then by doing that, we could expect some sort of security, some sort of law and order, and then the government should exert its authority across the country, because there are some areas where the government has not power there. So this is still, to me, a failed state. You see, so there are challenges and opportunities as well. So opportunities. So I would say that we, this country, Britain, our company, British companies, could invest in the DRC. As my view is within the international structure, when you see my friend has mentioned about international law there, and when I see the UN, I see NATO, the IMF and World Bank, and the G8. I think looking clearly, you see that the UK sits on Security Council, UN Security Council, and on the G8. And the UK is, to some extent, defending their former colonies. The UK is defending its former colonies to some. France is doing the same. So where is Congo? Who's defending Congo? No one.
But at the same time,
Yeah.
I mean, some people have argued that Congo, the government has basically abdicated its responsibility in terms of governance, because it's almost like Congo's almost like it's under international trusteeship, where World Bank officials, United Nations officials, United Nations peacekeepers, NGOs, they've taken responsibility for so much in the country. And I wonder, Natsno, if you could say something about the role of the international community in terms of almost taking over Congo, whether you'd agree with that analysis.
I mean, in terms of being able to assert your authority over the entire territory of Congo, I mean, very rarely have you seen it done, even in the recent past. And Jean has highlighted that fact. And as such, the government is relying both on need and also convenience on these actors to step in where they can't fill in those shoes, either because they don't want to or they're distracted with other, maybe more lucrative endeavors. If you look at outside of the donor community or the governmental space, if you look at the international private sector that's investing in Congo, each of them is trying to negotiate that environment by aligning themselves with power brokers or gatekeepers, as we like to call them. So you don't really have any type of unified governance body within Congo. So what you end up having is foreigners trying to penetrate or trying to enter Congo, setting up alliances with people who have set up their own minor fiefdoms in the country. And so that again exacerbates the problem and undermines the sense or this initiative of national cohesion and building that governance capacity within the country. I think that Congo, outside of the Western donor community or Western companies that are investing in there, also needs to be seen in the context of its immediate neighbors. They are not absolved from blame and acting as spoilers. We've seen how Rwandan intervention in Eastern Congo has only served to incite ethnic rivalries within it, and how what happened in Rwanda and Burundi 15 years ago had a huge implication for the bordering regions for Congo and has never really been addressed. And in fact, that's one of the triggers that led to what we've seen in the Eastern Congo rebellions to date. And in these regards, I think Congo has been both maybe willingly and unwillingly at the whim of the people surrounding it, and also the people who are presenting themselves as partners but actually taking control and not fostering that capability so Congo can actually contribute and become a partner itself rather than someone under the trusteeship of someone else.
Can I say something on that?
Sure.
This is something I just want to add. I think in the 21st century, you need strong allies. As I've just explained, Congo is an abandoned country. When the Congo in 1960 got independence from the Belgium left the country completely. And no one has cared about Congo since that period. So Congo needs strong. Right. Still, they left Congo. They abandoned the country. They abandoned.
Let's let her. Have you made your point?
Yeah. And I think Congo right now, in the 21st century, needs strong allies like the UK. You see what happened to Rwanda? Rwanda is a member of Commonwealth because the Rwandan people, they understood that they were in the same situation with Congo abandoned. No one is defending them internationally. And then now they are within the Commonwealth. They've got a strong ally, the UK. This is what Congo needs at the moment because no one is defending Congo internationally.
But isn't Congo big enough to look after itself? Why does it need someone to hold its hand?
I mean, forgive me, doesn't Congo need good leadership? It has an army, it has a police force, it has these things, but the army doesn't get paid. The money disappears on the way from Kinshasa to Eastern Congo. And so they, and many, some people argue that the army is kept deliberately divided and weak in order for no successful coups to happen and Kabila can maintain his position.
That is true. I don't dispute that. But above all, you need strong allies, like the Rwandan. I've got the British now, a member of the Commonwealth. So for me, the future of Congo belongs to the Commonwealth if we want to stabilize the country. That's my view going forward.
Do you think that would be helpful if Congo was allowed into the Commonwealth? Would that solve its problems?
Not necessarily, and I'd also highlight Congo's immediate neighbor, a country that also has vast natural resource wealth, is large, came out of a civil war and didn't really have external powers supporting it, Angola, but was able to do so, was able to, I mean, we can question to what success, but in terms of fostering national cohesion, having a strong central government, again, questioning its effectiveness, it has been able to set up a semblance of a unified state. And so it's not necessarily the antidote to Congo's problem to have it join the Commonwealth. It could be one step in that regard, but I definitely wouldn't put so much importance or stress on it.
But Rwanda is stable now.
Rwanda is much smaller.
Stable.
It's much smaller. I mean, it's smaller than the Kivu province. Yeah. So it's much easier when you have that cumbersome geography that you have to negotiate, ethnic diversity that you have to negotiate, divisive politics that successive governments have sown into the country. Then it's much harder to govern that space. Whereas Kagame had a narrative that he came in with. He was able to take over a territory. He had a unified and loyal army or armed force behind him. I mean, he had a number of advantages on his side in order to do what he's been able to do. It wasn't just guilt for what was allowed to happen, supposedly in Rwanda, that assisted its development and its post-conflict stability. You have to look at some of the more practical factors, and the fact that it has the population of a Congolese city is one thing that you'd have to look at.
And many people say that the roads of Rwanda are paved with the misery of the Congolese.
I wonder if now's the time to throw this discussion open to the floor. If anybody has any questions for our panel, please raise your hands and we'll bring the microphone to you. Should we start with this lady and then this gentleman? You go first.
Okay, well...
and can people say who they are before they ask their questions and
okay.
Which organisation they're from?
I'm Caroline Hellier. I'm a freelance journalist. Some people might know me as Digital Jelly, that's with a D, and a very long-term Congo watcher. I just wanted to raise some of the issues. You used Angola. Do you think Angola is a really good example, considering that actually Angola has an awful lot of unrest, and to me is the model that Congo is heading for, in as much as secure enclaves for big business to survive, whereas the rest is almost abandoned?
I wasn't necessarily speaking to it as an example to follow, but in terms of looking at being able to assert territorial control in such a large state. It didn't necessarily happen with Angola because it had foreign support. That was the only comparison I was showing.
And that brings me to my next point, which is addressed to you, I guess. Whilst I hear you 100% and love your work that you guys do, I have a real problem with Dodd-Frank and the representation of the DRC by particularly advocates in America. I think Movember Dezaleli has said that they've hijacked the representation of the Congo, and certainly you've got artisan miners getting very upset. You've got people like Severino saying that the problems are much, much more complex. They're land disputes that go beyond just mining. Yeah. And the militia issues, you know, our friend here is saying about armies and armaments, but surely disarmament's not going to happen until there's employment.
Absolutely.
So how do you see that these Congo conflict mineral legislations are possibly going to be enforced or actually function until other state-forming practices are put in place?
Well, to answer that part of the question first, I think the very premise of what's in the law, which is not fully fleshed out, as I say, and I'll come on to why that does matter in a moment, the very premise of it is that you disentangle the main thrust of the law from the question of whether or not the state will function. It's nothing to do with the state, it's just about companies that report to the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US. And that aspect of it, I think, is pretty smart. I mean, if you've got a set of standards for the trade which are bound up with whether or not the Congolese state can first deliver on this or create conditions like that, then you're facing a complete non-starter. But the devil is in the detail, and the main bit of Dodd-Frank, which is actually going to set out what actually has to happen, is to do with what Dodd-Frank means by due diligence. It says companies must do due diligence, but we don't yet know what that means. And these regulations, which are due to complete the law, were originally due to come out in April. They didn't, and I think the initial reasons why were just bureaucratic overload. I mean, this is a law the size of a telephone book. It's vast. And the regulators have had their work cut out just finishing it off. But now there are other issues. There's a big pushback by corporate lobby groups who threaten to sue the SEC if the regulations are not to their liking, and that's brought about a lot of delays, which I actually think are the main reason why there are problems associated with this. You have a phantom law that's looming. You have people interpreting it in different ways. You have electronics companies, for example, which, as of the start of April, said, we will not buy any Congolese material unless it has a written conflict-free guarantee. There's nothing in the law saying that that's required, but they took either sincerely or as a bargaining position, depending on your point of view, this very absolute view, which has played a big part in meaning why there's been a drop-off in the minerals trade. And yes, there are artisanal miners out of work. There are some who've moved to neighbouring provinces.
And taken up arms.
Evidence of that is sketchy, to say the least. Every time we go there, we sit down with the people who follow DDR issues, and we ask them the same questions. Has there been a rise in violent crime in mining areas? Is there evidence of groups rearming? Is there evidence of a link between miners not being able to mine and groups rearming? And so far, the answer has been a consistent no. There is a pattern of violence with peaks and troughs in the Kivus. And so at a given time, you might be able to say it's higher this month or lower this month than it was the previous one. But no, so far there is no evidence of a correlation between the decline in the mining sector, which is not absolute, incidentally, and rearmament of armed groups. There's a very big and very detailed report coming out in just a couple of weeks from the UN group of experts, which will be very interesting to see what they say on this.
Absolutely. But this then feeds into you saying Bosco lives on the border. You have the whole Banyamalenga problem there. What is to stop the circumnavigation of all of these issues for companies just to smuggle them straight across the border, sell them to China, and recycle them back into the whole system? This is why I don't understand.
Yeah,
why
the simple answer, and forgive me because it's trying to condense quite a lot of complicated ins and outs, but the law says if you're a company that reports to the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, anyway, in addition to your existing reporting requirements, you have to first ascertain where your minerals came from, which country. If they came from Australia, end of the line. If they came from Congo or an adjoining country, then you have to do a much more detailed investigation of your supply chain. You have to come back to the SEC and say, well, these are due diligence measures that we took. This is what we did. This is what we found. Now, if you're in a company which is reporting to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and your supplier or one of your suppliers manufactures in China, you're going to have to crawl all over your Chinese supplier and demand some answers. And if they say, well, I'm not going to give you any because that's not the way we operate in China, that's probably not going to prevail for very long, because there is such a substantial slice of the global market which is parked in the US, or companies that report to the US regulator, including some foreign ones, that actually the net this casts is potentially pretty wide. But there will be gaps in it for sure. I mean, I can give you an example. There are some companies which say to you, we won't be caught by this, or this won't work because of China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can think of a company which operates as a comptoir in the Kivus, is Indian, sends all its concentrate to a smelter in Kashmir. They produce almost exclusively for the Indian market. It won't cover them. That's a problem, I admit. But I actually think that the scope of this thing, if it's implemented, which is a big if, is quite substantial. It's not enough, and yes, there should be similar legislation passed elsewhere to even things out.
Thank you. The gentleman back there now.
Yes, thank you very much. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former strategic intelligence analyst for Customs and Excise, covering and later based with an EU mission in the former Soviet countries. And I have two questions. The second one has been partially answered by the gentleman from Global Witness. It's also based on having, when I was in the State Border Guards HQ in Ukraine for several years, which was directly opposite the State Security HQ, where we visited quite a lot, we saw visible evidence of the conflict minerals chains, including at Odessa airport and indeed on the streets of Odessa. First question, both are related to how can you get the attitude changed, which is where the gentleman's comments about China perhaps complying, I think, is very relevant. How do you get the international community to deal with, first, the Stephen Saka question, which was the question he put to Alain Dos of the UN mission in Congo on Hard Talk in late 2007 or early 2008. How can you get the UN to properly fulfill as much as is reasonably possible of its mandate, because there's too much dubious activity within UN missions itself? Stephen Saka pointed out that he had recently returned from Goma and he had observed a senior UN man very late at night come out of a bar, obviously drunk, and with two young local women. But I can assure you, incidentally, in the EU mission in Ukraine, we had problems with that as well. So how do you get the UN to take a more committed approach on particularly the protection of people, but that will spin off into other issues? And the second one is China. When I was working in Tanzania, we noticed that certain revenue modernization programs, stopping smuggling and getting proper accountability, were very, very difficult, if not to say impossible, because of Chinese non-cooperation. Now, I noticed that there's a humanitarian and public interest and public opinion issue in relation to conflict minerals, which wasn't there in just normal revenue goods. But I have to say I wouldn't entirely share the cautious optimism of Global Witness. We've got a real problem because we've got major countries, frankly, not bothered at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe, do you want to answer the question about China first? And then we'll turn to the problems with the United Nations after that.
Sure, I'll say something briefly on that too. Yeah, it's a fair point, and I don't want to sound overly optimistic. There is a huge challenge there in terms of how you persuade companies which are based in countries where the notion that you apply certain standards to the way you do business in relation to human rights, impacts on conflict, that sort of thing is pretty alien. There isn't a magic bullet answer to this. I mean, part of the answer, well, the basis for one, is that if you're looking at this problem in the broader perspective, it's a global supply chain issue. I mean, these materials move all over the place, as we know, to all corners of the earth. That potentially gives you a bit of traction as long as you're dealing with companies in the supply chain, however reluctant or disinterested they may be, who are connected to it. But it isn't enough. There will be a need to engage the governments of countries like China directly on these kinds of issues. That's a very long-term endeavor, but it's a challenge for organizations like ours, as it is for governments and companies based in this part of the world. One of the things that I would say, though, that we have picked up in work that we've done in other countries, actually Burma's an example, Burma to do with the timber trade, legal timber going to China, is that while it's absolutely true that if you go to Chinese companies or Chinese state interests and say, well, you really shouldn't be doing this because by doing this you're contributing to human rights abuses, you're benefiting people who commit human rights abuses, it doesn't really cut a lot of ice, particularly when you're referring to international covenants of some kind or another. They're very easily ignored. What seems to be slightly harder to ignore, although not impossible, is situations where the company, let's stick with the China example, is confronted with a situation where they're caught breaching national law, particularly if it's in a country where there's a very strong political overlay in terms of this is South-South cooperation, we're not the colonialists, we're here on the basis of peaceful coexistence and harmony and all that sort of thing. And as I said, we've seen this elsewhere, where we went through a stage of figuring out what you do about Chinese trade with Burma, which was causing all sorts of mayhem, and there didn't seem much mileage in the human rights arguments, but actually quite a lot of things did happen when we proved quite explicitly that the Chinese companies were breaching host countries' laws, Chinese laws. That seemed to hit a nerve in terms of the reputational sense that the Chinese government had of itself, which reference to human rights didn't. And so to that end, I think one of the things that can be built upon is, and this comes back to the role of the Congolese state, is making sure that they have the laws in place very clearly and explicitly which govern this kind of behavior. Even if the Congolese state is not going to be the enforcer, it gives local groups, international groups like us, something to get stuck into. And before I wrap up, because I'm talking too much on this, but just to give a slightly anecdotal example, I was in the region in April and talked to some Chinese businessmen then about international standards for supply chain controls, due diligence. And they did a fantastic impression of people who'd never heard of this and had no idea what I was talking about. But then if you fast forward to just a month ago, it wasn't actually me, it was a couple of colleagues, and they were sitting down for a couple of meetings with Chinese traders in the Kivus who deal in minerals, and I think are going to get shown in a very negative light, incidentally, when the next group of experts report comes out. And we couldn't find evidence they were complying with these standards, but they knew exactly what we were talking about. And the reason why was because they'd just been passed into Congolese law. It doesn't mean that they're not going to try and circumvent them or cheat. But there was something there in front of them that they realized they could not brush off quite as easily as some lofty international set of standards that have been signed off in New York or Paris. On the UN peacekeepers, I'll say something very quick, because I'm sure that others have got other things probably more insightful to say, but I think it's very difficult to get past the fact that the countries which finance the UN, set the agenda, just don't really care enough. That's what it boils down to. And it's terribly easy with a country as vast as Congo and a peacekeeping operation as sprawling as MONUSCO to say, but of course we care, there's 20,000 troops, we spend all this money, blah, blah, blah. But there's not the real commitment there. You don't have the countries that set the agenda and pay the bills contributing their own troops. And you have poor command structures and poor accountability amongst those troops that are there. And in a sense, I think that they are stretched, that's true, but they're not really emboldened either by the national governments that send the troops or by the UN command to be adventurous. And I'll give you an example. They have a mandate now to, on the minerals issue, to play a much more active role in doing inspections, patrols, that sort of thing, to interrupt illicit trade. But they're not really using it, and the reasons why become quite clear when you go and talk to some of these people. If you go to Walikale, which is one of the regions Fiona mentioned, which is kind of the epicenter of everything that's wrong to do with mineral exploitation and militarization in the Kivus, and you go to the UN office, it's a wonderful spot, it's on a lovely little hill with the most fantastic views ever, and you talk to these guys, they're an Indian contingent, what are you going to do about this? And you can have quite a good conversation with intelligent people who sort of do, once they get the sense you're not just trying to catch them out, say, yeah, actually we could do a bit more of that, we could do a bit of this. But the thing which is running through it is they are absolutely terrified of getting clobbered for the next time they fail to prevent a massacre, because that's the thing which at the moment the Security Council is most exercised about. And so they are not prepared to take any risks in terms of doing some work, even work which they're mandated to do with the minerals trade, because they're absolutely terrified that perhaps while they're doing that there's going to be another massacre, another mass rape, and then they're going to get blamed, and maybe they will actually be at fault, but that's not the way they're thinking about it. It's about, well, we have to make these choices, we're not really incentivized to take risks, and so we're going to do the minimum on a range of issues which are actually core to their mandate and core to preventing the next massacre.
Just to add, I think Mike said most of it, but I think with any UN mission, the key is leadership on a from the commander level, but also on a local level, and you can see that in a number of UN missions. Unfortunately, in Eastern Congo, especially where most of the MONUSCO troops are, there doesn't seem to be great local leadership. An example, which was a few years ago, the Kiwanja massacre on the 5th of October 2008, which was said to be led by Bosco Ntaganda, where 150 civilians were murdered. It was less than a mile from a UN base, but at the time I believe that they had no translators, and nothing was done at all by the UN. And I can remember when I was in as a sort of alternative or on the other side of the coin in Bunia, May 2003, I went to do a report for Newsnight. It was the first day of the ceasefire. The deputy commander of MONUC, as it was called then, Colonel Volo, a French paratrooper, was there in person, going to negotiate with people. He had one shirt which was ripped from where he'd been fired. People had shot arrows at him, and he'd gone to actually disperse the local militia groups. He'd gone to physically pick up injured civilians who'd been wounded by mortars, and he was going to negotiate and sort the situation out. But I think you can see in many UN missions, whether it's Bosnia and the difference between what happened in Srebrenica and what happened in Gorazda. Srebrenica fell, Gorazda didn't, and there were UN contingents in both those places. So I think it's about leadership.
And that's true. I think the other thing we need is a UN strong mandate to arrest.
But they have quite a strong mandate.
It's not strong to arrest. Disarm the militias, because the UN soldiers, peacekeepers, they don't do that. They don't arrest people. They just there to disperse. That's it. But we need a powerful mandate of arresting those militias and disarming the militias. This is the way forward. This is a challenge for us if we want to make a difference on disarmament. So we've got 80,000 UN peacekeepers there. What they are doing?
But you
They
also
should
have
be
to remember
arresting,
that,
disarming the militias.
forgive me, Jean, the government has said peace before justice. The government has said, you know, let everyone can put down their weapons, doesn't matter what you've done, we'll put peace before justice. And, you know, unfortunately, that just cannot work. They have to have justice in order to get peace. So going back to what I started off by saying is that until there is an end to impunity, until the government says, actually, we have to have justice so that we can get peace.
I would like to see UN peacekeepers with a strong mandate to make a difference on disarmament. Yeah.
Should we have
18,000 in Congo. What for? If they don't arrest and disarm, what for?
Let's give the audience a chance to ask more questions. There's somebody at the back, so we'll go there first.
Jim Scott, Civil Service. My question in part follows on from the previous gentleman's question. We've heard about neighbouring states' influence. We've heard about international companies' influence, and just then we've heard about nation states that turn a blind eye to various human rights. I wonder if I could ask the panel to venture which international nation states they believe have the most proactive and direct influence over Congo's businesses and Congolese government.
Thank you. Maybe we can turn to you first, because of your analysis of the more sort of regional, international perspective.
Yes, I think it depends on what topic you're treating. If you're looking at the mining sector within the Kivus, Rwanda is very strong in that sense. If we're looking at business interests within Congo generally, South Africa, Zuma was very close with Kabila, and South Africa has maintained that very close relationship. So in instances where you've seen mining contracts cancelled and re-awarded, they're usually re-awarded to British Island registered South African firms that are coincidentally run by the nephew of some prominent political leader within the country. I think within the... I was going to get to that. You have individuals who are close to the Kinshasa elite, particularly Kabila, and as the woman in the audience is named, Dan Gutler is one of them, an Israeli businessman, who has benefited from the privatization of Genkamin mines, the ones that were underreported, I guess you would say, earlier this year. You also have bigger mining firms, I would say at this point, because most of the oil production is offshore, so they don't have as much of influence within the political arena. I would highlight major producers, so that would include Glencore, First Quantum, before they fell out of grace with the Kinshasa government and other such miners, who, considering the amount of business that they're doing there, do have some sway with the either local government. In the case of these major miners, it's mostly in Katanga, so with Governor Moise Katumbi, or with companies that have operations across the country or areas outside of Katanga, and more likely be closer to the Kinshasa elite, so close connections to Kabila, and that would be the businessmen that I've named and the South African interests.
Sorry, I wonder if I could just add that, in particular, which nation states are the governments themselves. You know, China's been mentioned. I'm asking the questions about which governments have the biggest influence into Congo, being proactively pushing their interests and their influence into Congo.
I would have to say it would be South Africa, you have China. Otherwise, you just have commercial interests going in rather than government interests. And if governments are engaging with Congo, it is through multilateral organizations or IGOs such as the UN, and not necessarily bilateral relations. Jean has mentioned that the UK is the biggest bilateral donor to Congo, so in that sense it is active, but outside of that, in terms of pushing their commercial agendas, commercial diplomacy, I would restrict that to the ones that I've named.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add?
No, I think that summed it up pretty well. I have colleagues, I should mention, who are much more specialised than me on issues ranging from industrial scale mining to forest management in Congo, who'd have more to say on that. But I think my colleague has summed it up pretty well. I think there are certain countries where you can see there's a particular strategic interest at play in maximising business opportunities, and China and South Africa are obviously pretty high up that list. But I think, I mean, forgive me, but with reference to the issue which I know better with minerals in the Kivus, and I'm not suggesting it's illustrative of the country as a whole, but it's a real ragbag of different types of companies from many different parts of the world. It's not particularly restricted to one or two nationalities or ethnic groups.
Thank you.
Can I just add a multinational company, Anglo-American, extracting gold in Eastern Congo, with a subsidiary company which is called Anglo Gold Ashanti. And then you've got in the center of the country, in Bujimai, in Kasai, you've got the Bees company exploiting diamond as well. So I think you've got various companies there exploiting minerals there in the DRC. Even I think a company from India is extracting, I think, copper from the Katanga province in the town called Kolwezi. So there is it is open. Anyone could go there. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question in the front.
Sorry, just on a quick point of fact.
Just hold on for the microphone.
Just on a quick point of fact on those two of the companies you mentioned, Anglo Gold Ashanti is no longer owned by Anglo American. They've spun that off, and De Beers is no longer in the DRC. We're from De Beers, so we're not there currently.
Okay. That's right.
Thank you. And the question in the front here.
My name is Jessica. I'm a student at the School of Oriental and African Studies. My question is for Fiona. Multiple journalists who have been out to Goma lately have noticed that when they've talked to some of the rape victims, the rape victims have been saying that the perpetrators are no longer military, or they're non-military. And so I was wondering, how do you think this form of intimate violence has spread throughout some of the societies in the East? And also, have there been any psychological or counseling services that have tried to address that, or is that basically an afterthought in the mix of all the other problems there?
I saw Andrew Harding's piece today that was said exactly that. My experience, the last time I was talking specifically to survivors of rape was in June in Minova, sort of in South Kivu, and most of the rape victims, a lot of them come from the Haut Plateau region where there's a lot of FDLR activity. So the anecdotal evidence that I was getting was that it was still armed groups, but I think what one has to remember is that if people are now in the civilian life, they may have, just demobilized. Who is to say, whether you have a generation of men as well as women who have spent a long time under arms, from the age of 8 or 9 possibly. So they may no longer be in uniform, but they may well have been, brutalized by years of being soldiers, and feel that, rape is normal, or that is something that they're entitled or is easy to do, unfortunately. As far as counselling, there are counselling and psychological services and help to people. City of Joy in Bukavu, which is affiliated with Pansy Hospital and run by V-Day. I think they have some programs. For instance, the woman that I was working with, on a very, very small scale, she's devised a kind of very broad spectrum of help for women that they're brought to her, or she goes and finds them from a village that's been attacked. She gets the medical help, but the first thing that happens when they arrive at her centre is that she or one of her trained workers in the centre sort of debriefs them. And one of the key things that she tells them is that they're not alone, they're not the only person this has happened to, and you can see that genuinely helps these women, mainly women. Obviously, unfortunately there are men who are being raped as well, and that has its own difficult problems associated with it. But there are, you know, on a small scale, there are psychological programs which obviously need to be developed, but it is happening.
Thank you. We had a question in the back.
Hi, 2 questions. Hi, Kate Short. I wanted to ask Fiona firstly how you feel venturing far north into North Kivu or south, and even though the UN tell you not to go, maybe to move from Goma, I mean, how do you feel when you go that far away as a woman? And I wanted to ask Jean, since, is it Alan Ross went in 2008 at the end up to Dwilu in the north for the UN meeting, what is the situation with regard to Joseph Kony and the LRA? Thank you.
Should we start with
you, Fiona? Sure. Well, there isn't any wood, I don't think, nearby. Touch wood, I've been very fortunate. I've worked with a fantastic, most of the time I work with a fantastic colleague in the Kivus who's a journalist, has an NGO, and we've worked together for, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years or more. I think I first worked. Well, he's got his kind of own NGO that he set up a few years ago, sort of quite a small one. He's fantastic, and we work well together. Maybe I've just been very lucky, but I feel I've never sort of had huge problems, and maybe it's being sensitive to the situation, whether it's, I've been in Frontline, army camps, or in Bunya during just the first few days of the ceasefire when there were, lots of armed groups around, or whatever. But I think I've just been very fortunate. I'm working with good people and make sure I work with good people who we work together well.
Thank you. Jean, if you could answer the question about the
Sorry, can I just add one thing? Because I was there in the north, the Mai with kids who had guns who were off their heads with drugs, and I suppose what I want to ask you is at what extent of fear do you have as a female journalist out there? I mean, do you think, oh, well, I just go anyway because I want to get the images? Or is there a level to which you actually say, no, I'm not going to do this?
I think there's a certain awareness that as a woman, maybe you feel slightly more a target than maybe a man would. But I just do a lot of, I try and do a lot of research where I go, and, I can make a decision at the time whether I think it's safe to go or not, and whether it's time to leave or not. I think, one just works as best you can to get the story and show what's going on. And I have to say I'm really tempted, because I know as a woman it's okay to come from you, but I think sometimes it's slightly unfair that a man would never be asked this question. And my sister was a doctor in the army, and she went to Sarajevo. It's her birthday today. She died tragically in 2005, but she arrived in Sarajevo in July 1992 at the height of the war. And the first thing Martin Bell, bless him, it's wonderful, said to her, which went out on BBC television, was, what does it feel like to be a woman in Sarajevo? And she said, I ride horses in England and it's far more dangerous than being in Sniper Alley. So, I think, we're all trying to do a job, we're all trying to show what's going on, and one that just has to make an individual assessment, whether you're in Congo, whether you're in Iraq, wherever it is. It's about being a professional journalist and trying to show the story. So I think for me that's how I'd respond.
Thank you.
The Lord Resistance Army of Joseph Kony is still operating in eastern Congo, brutalizing people, burning villages, committing war crime against humanity. This is what I said. There is a need for an international strategy for disarming those militias. Disarmament is very, very, very important. So there is an organization in America called Resolve Uganda, actually. They are campaigning for Joseph Kony to be arrested. And they've managed to get President Obama on board. And there is a strategy, a US strategy actually, on how to pinpoint Joseph Kony and arrest him, dismantle his militias. I think the US has sent some officers there to do that job. So I'm glad that this is happening. And I would like to see the UK as well involved, because we need a proper strategy, international strategy on how to disarm militias in the region for peace, to advance peace. This is the way forward. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? There's one there.
I'm Ollie Buston. I'm currently doing a bit of research for an American NGO called the Eastern Congo Initiative. Britain's has limited influence in this big country, but we are the biggest donor. We have strong, complicated relations with Kagame and Museveni. We're in the EU. We're on the Security Council. So the question is, after the election, which is obviously difficult to predict, what should Britain's main policy priority towards DRC be?
Who wants to answer that? Maybe, do you have any thoughts on that, Natsuni?
Really not in the space to give policy advice, so I would like to defer to my colleagues.
I think continuing engagement with the DRC, continuing helping the DRC to be stabilized, actually. This is what I should advise the British government to continue doing, because achieving peace in the region is paramount. Peace in the region would benefit all of us. I think there is another issue, a security issue, because Congo can't afford anymore to remain a lawless place. Congo has radioactive minerals, uranium, plutonium, and then it is too risky for all of us to let Congo a failed state. Yeah. So continue engagement and continue helping Congo, and with my vision, actually, I would like to see Congo a member of the Commonwealth one day.
I would say, I'm afraid, the same thing, that Britain should put pressure on the new government to arrest war criminals and to impose a rule of law and end impunity.
Yeah, I would echo the comments made by Jean-Roger and by Fiona too. I mean, we have a particular focus on issues to do with natural resources. There are many other issues that need addressing too, which are beyond our realms of expertise. But of course, if you're trying to think of a country which has potentially massive potential on the basis of its natural wealth, which so far has not been realized, you would tend to think of Congo, and it is a huge issue. There are many, many different aspects to it, but two I would pick out. One, first of all, to do with the Kivus and the conflict, is that the British government, they do have influence. It's not a case of being the only influential player or being able, even if it were appropriate, which it's not, to dictate terms to the Congolese government, but they do need to make a much more energetic and effective use of that influence to persuade the Congolese government to remove its own military from the mining sector in the Kivus, in the conflict-affected area, because when we're talking about conflict minerals here coming out of Congo, most of those materials are tainted in that way because of the involvement of armed groups which are part of the national army. So that's one key thing. And another, which comes back a little bit to this question about business interest, business influence, and the allocation of contracts, is much greater transparency in the allocation of contracts, not just what's been allocated, but how the deals are done, and much greater enforcement of the law as regards how natural resource wealth is allocated to companies, and how the laws governing its exploitation are upheld. Those are two pretty big things, but I think perhaps the point that on behalf of Global Witness, we'd like to see the UK government recognise and stress in its dealings with the Congolese government is that these are issues which in the first instance are political. They're not technical. And one of the mistakes which donors like the UK, the US and others keep making over and over again deliberately in Congo is to cast essentially political issues as technical ones and announce all sorts of well-moneyed programs to sort the problem out, which they must know deep down are not going to work until there's a fundamental shift in attitude from the people at the top, which would actually make it possible for those things to take effect.
Thank you. Sorry.
I think I'm pinching the microphone again. I apologise. I wonder if I could ask about youth employment and unemployment. As I read, Congo has a population of 70 million, of which just under half is under the age of 16. I wondered if the panel might talk about the levels of unemployment, employment, and what their concerns and hopes are for growing that.
I think unemployment is not only for young people. I think most of Congolese people are unemployed because of the situation. This is a country which is very rich in minerals, but people are very poor. This is a failed state, actually. In that failed state, how could you get people employed? Where are the jobs come from? That's the question. So it is a challenge. Reading through the manifesto from the candidate, I couldn't see any idea put forward about how to help young people to get employed, how to reduce unemployment in Congo. I couldn't see it. Yes. A proper policy, a clear policy, effective policy, because of the situation there. This is a desperate situation, I may say it. So I think what we need to do is to remind politicians, Congolese politicians, to focus on how to reduce unemployment. They should be working very hard on reducing unemployment. This is what I could recommend.
And what would you suggest to do that?
Me, personally. Right, I'm not running for president. Right, I think what we need to do is allow investment from Western countries, from Western companies. This is the only way we could try to increase employment there, to create jobs. So without investment, there is no jobs, you see, because of the state of the country. So we need British companies to go there to invest, to create jobs. This is what we need. And then this will help to reduce unemployment. This is what I can say for the time being. So, yeah.
Kerry Gold claims it's one of their best markets coming down.
You see them everywhere in Ghana, don't you?
Right. Yeah. We need investment. Yeah.
There's a gentleman at the back who wants to ask.
I just wondered if I could ask a sort of big question about the Kivus. Do you think it's ever going to get sorted out? Or do you think it's going to sort of, I mean, I'm sorry, it's a rather depressing note to end on perhaps, but I mean, if it's going to be Africa's Palestine, that we're going to be having meetings like this in another 50 years. The reason I'm asking is I'm a writer with HarperCollins, so I do fiction and I can create fictional scenarios. I just published a novel called Warlord on Kivu, where I get China to lease it off the government and invest in an army to sort it out, which is, you know, the luxury of being a fiction writer. But I mean, do you think, in the course of looking into it, I think that there was, I mean, somebody said that the insurgencies exist not because the insurgency is strong, but because the central authority is weak. And that seems to be the problem in Congo, that the government is part of the problem, it's not part of the solution. And there doesn't seem to be the threat of credible force coming from anyone. The FDLR is the key to the issue, and they're not going to go away quietly. No one can make them go away. So can somebody give me some positive thoughts on that?
By rebuilding Congo's institutions, this will allow the government to exert its authority across the country. And then this will maintain the territorial integrity of Congo and even sovereignty. So what we need now, the challenge is how do we help Congo to continue rebuilding institutions, to fill the vacuum since King Leopold. Because I think the Congo issue is very complex. Is a legacy from the era of King Leopold until now, you see. So we need, I think, to support Congo on how to rebuild its institutions, to fill in the vacuum on military side, political side, on any aspect of life there. This is my view. This is, I think, we should be doing if we want the country to stick together and to maintain Congo's territorial integrity, independence, and sovereignty. It is about building institutions, strong institutions, and this is possible.
And what do you think, Natsna? Do you think we'll be sitting here in 15 years discussing what to do about the problem of the Kivus, or do you think there's any light at the end of the tunnel?
It depends on a number of factors. What Jean has brought up is central to that, is creating institution in order to extend the government's legitimacy and credibility into these regions. The fact that neighboring militaries operate with relative impunity in these regions undermines the government. The fact that its military or elements within it are engaging in criminality undermines its credibility. It needs to be able to build the institutional capacity in order to create loyalty and accountability within these institutions. But then on the other side, outside of the armed or security space, it also needs to create the incentives to motivate rebels or those who are armed to put down their guns in order to pursue other economic opportunities. I mean, I very much talk about this similar case within Somalia in talking about building a state within one that has collapsed over 2 decades ago. And it's about offering incentives. No one is willingly picking up a gun, is willingly putting their life at stake, but they're doing it because they feel that that's the only recourse that they have in order to guarantee their livelihoods or survival and that of their families or other dependents that they may have. And you effectively have other groups that are formed, such as non-state actors, rebel groups and whatnot, who offer that security, offer those incentives that they need. So you have to pull away from their recruitment in order to take away from the driving forces behind this insecurity in the Kivus, in the Niger Delta, in Somalia. I mean, it's unfortunately something that you see across the sub-Saharan African region.
Can I just add that, I think that certainly the people that I've, been fortunate to come across in Eastern Congo are enormously resourceful and resilient, and despite all the things that we've been talking about tonight, find a way to survive and continue their lives. And I think for me, one of the most inspiring things was talking to a student in Goma who, I think she's 19, and she said, I want to be the first female president of Congo because I want to help the people of my country. And as long as there are young people who aspire to this kind of thing, then maybe there is some hope for Congo.
Thank you very much for that. We have time for one more question. It's over there. Thank you.
I was just wondering, I mean, it was sort of mentioned before, but what positive role do you think other African countries can play to help support Congo at the moment, especially if Kabila stays in power? Because I was doing some research about how South Africa was involved with the UN and the EU in the peace talks that led to the first elections. So I was just wondering, especially the stronger African countries like South Africa, what can they do?
I think my understanding is this. I think countries on eastern side of Congo, I may say Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda, they would prefer Kabila to stay in power, to continue. And then countries on the western side of Congo, Angola, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Angola and Namibia, they will prefer the opposition to be in power. Mugabe, it's not clear. Mugabe is as linked with Laurent Kabila, late Laurent Kabila, and Mugabe is actually trying to protect Joseph Kabila. So because of, I think there is some sort of mineral interest in the country, this is how countries surrounding Congo will try to behave to protect their own interests inside the DRC, which I think the international community should stop, actually, because Congo is a sovereign country, and this is how the situation is now at the moment, and I think we will see after the results. I think it will be like I'm explaining. Those on the eastern side of Congo will support Kabila. Those on the western part of Congo will support the opposition. So that is the geopolitics of the situation in the region, yeah, we'll see.
But countries that aren't necessarily the neighboring countries, like maybe Nigeria and South Africa, that are further away. And
right. South Africa has interest because of the dam, the Inga Dam for electricity. South Africa has interest because of a connection with, first of all, Laurent Kabila and Joseph Kabila, commercial interest. And Nigeria, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Nigeria has interest. Although I think the former president, Olusegun Obasanjo, was the UN envoy to broker peace in Eastern Congo. But I don't think if there is any interest, Nigeria has any interest in the DRC. I'm not sure about that.
Does anyone have anything to add to that?
Just to pick up where Jean has left off, I mean, you have to look at it, who are the regional players and who have interests. And Nigeria doesn't share any borders, it doesn't have any trade with DRC. It could possibly, considering the resource wealth that both of them have and just the sheer size of the population and markets that they have. But they're more concerned about stability within countries. So unless there is any attempt at a coup or armed insurrection within the country, it's very unlikely that Nigeria is going to step forward. But if you look at DRC amongst its neighbors, not maybe its immediate neighbors, but within the SDAC region, it is very much South Africa that's at the forefront. Mm-hmm. But then you also see that South Africa has commercial interests and political alliances with DRC, so you're going to question to what extent they're actually going to push forward reform or hold DRC to account, Kabila to account. Should we find next week that the election results are contested by the opposition, or should we find that that the opposition actually wins, Tshisekedi wins the election, and Kabila or PPRD members refuse to allow him to step down? So if you look at it, unfortunately, those who are actively involved are those who have interests, and those who aren't involved are those who don't have any immediate interests. And so unless it's for the sake of stability, they're unlikely to intervene, because every African leader is probably afraid of setting a dangerous precedent. If you looked at how they were pussyfooting around whether or not they should put pressure on Gbagbo to step down, I mean, they held out until the very end. I'm not even talking about the Arab Spring countries in the north, but where you had a return to civil war within a country and an election where majority of the global community supported the opponent and not the incumbent, you still had the African Union, which is tasked with ensuring democratic transition of power and a host of other criteria, just sitting there in silence. So, I mean, it showed that when it is important, it can be impotent. So I think it's unlikely that anyone's going to take any decisive action in DRC in terms of fostering reform. And if they do, it's likely to be in their own interest.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for this really rich discussion. All of you have had fantastic things to say, even though we don't know who's won this election. It's much clearer, to me anyway, the huge challenges that Congo faces, but also the many opportunities. So thank you to all of our panelists for a really good discussion.